In today's episode, we are celebrating the resurrection. And one of the things each gospel writer had to do was to choose what stories did they want to include about the resurrection to talk about the impact of the resurrection. And in today's episode, we're going to be looking at one of those stories from the Gospel of Luke, and oh my, it's stunning. And hey, if you find this teaching to be helpful, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and just share this episode with someone you think could benefit from it. All right, let's now dive into this resurrection episode. Well, happy Easter, everyone. I hope you all had a rockin' resurrection celebration. And for those of you who will be watching or listening to this on the release date, Easter was just a couple of days ago. And for others of you, you'll be listening to this or watching it later on, so I hope you had a fantastic celebration. Because Easter isn't just a day we celebrate, it is a way of being in the world. Because of the resurrection, we are given hope and life every single day. So I hope that it's been a wonderful season for you and that you continue to celebrate the reality of the resurrection and the implications for our lives. Well, today we find ourselves around a table. And for those of you who are watching, you go, of course you're around a table. But we have many people who listen in as podcasters as well. So we're around a table today. And if you have been following Walking the Text for any length of time, you will know that meal scenes in the Bible are ridiculously important moments. Whether it is a meal of reconciliation or a meal of love and acceptance, like what we find in Luke 15 when Jesus is sharing a meal with tax collectors and sinners. Anytime you come to a meal scene, you want to pause and just ask what significant thing is underway. Because whenever there is a meal, there is more that is going on. And so for our time today, we're going to look at a meal scene that actually happens on Resurrection Sunday. And it's in Luke 24, a story that maybe many of you know well, typically called the Road to Emmaus story. And admittedly, we could do an entire mini-series on just Luke 24. It's loaded, and particularly the story we're going to be looking at today, it is loaded. But we're going to just kind of be passing over some things in order to establish the key connections for what I want to share with you today. So this is Luke chapter 24, beginning in verse 13. And I just want to read this amazing story, and then we'll go back through and talk about some of the key points that Luke is trying to help us to see. So it goes like this. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. It's just like, what is going on here? This is Resurrection Sunday. They don't know Jesus has been resurrected from the dead. And Jesus is like, what's happened? What's been going on? And they said, "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him." Verse 21, "But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." But we had hoped. Like, that is the hot spot of their pain. They had certain expectations, and the realities, as best as they knew it in those moments, didn't align. And that's always where pain, disappointment, frustration, the crisis of faith occurs, is between our expectations and our realities. And their way of just summarizing it in such a poignant way, we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb earlier this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but him they did not see. And then Jesus said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. I mean, imagine being on the road that day and hearing Jesus make all of these connections for these two disciples. Now, this is one of the things that you could just camp on for a long time, but I just want to point out, because this is one of the stunning facets of this story, is that Jesus didn't just say to them, "Hey, you should just have faith that everything's going to work out." Jesus goes, "I'm going to actually take you back into the scriptures, and I am going to systematically work through all of the ways in which scriptures have been pointing to me." Which, this is one of the things that, as someone who has taught the text for about 15 years now, is that I hear people say all the time as it relates to Christianity, well, you just got to have faith. You just got to believe. And that is true. There is an enormous amount of faith that it requires to believe that Jesus was who he said he was and did what was said that he did. But there's also this aspect of logic as well. And it's almost kind of like they sit on opposite ends of the spectrum in discussions around Christianity. People will say, well, you just got to have faith. And then other people will say, yeah, but there's got to be logic. And if it's illogical, then we can't really believe that Jesus was who he said he was. And it's almost kind of like people are saying, the logic of it all doesn't match up with what the scripture says. And people will say, you just got to have faith. What I love here in this moment is that Jesus pulls these two together. It is about faith, but it is also about logic as well. And Jesus walks these two disciples through the logic of all of these stories and all of these passages that pointed to the fact that the Messiah had to suffer and die and that he would be raised again. And you go, well, I wonder what Jesus said. Well, so much of the New Testament writers are actually making those connections for us. So read the New Testament. That's the answer to that. But Jesus is pulling these two together. And then he said to them, after he said all the scriptures concerning himself, verse 28, as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening, the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. Verse 30, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" And then they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem, and then it tells us that from there they go and tell the 11, and they share their particular story of what happened. And there you go. That's the story that Luke includes. And what I want to do is just kind of step back for a moment and just ask this question. Why would Luke include this story in his biography on Jesus? And really not only just Luke, but all of the gospel writers. They have all of these stories that they're able to draw from that happened, but they all tell different stories in their biography of Jesus, especially following the resurrection. Matthew has a story that he's telling, Mark's telling a story, John tells a story, and Luke tells a story. And the question I have is, why is Luke telling this particular story? Because it only shows up in Luke. It doesn't show up in any of the other gospel writers' accounts. What is Luke trying to do? Well, let me give you the answer to that, and then let me show you how he's doing it. The answer to why he includes this story is that Luke is demonstrating how everything that was lost in the garden back in Genesis 3 has been restored in the resurrection, and it is being recognized here in Emmaus. So what was lost in Eden is restored in the resurrection and recognized here in Emmaus. And the question becomes, how? How is Luke helping us to see this? Well, first of all, let's begin with the characters. Verse 18, one of them named Cleopas. So we get the name of one of the two disciples. And this is helpful for a couple of reasons. One is we know we're not dealing with one of the remaining 11 main disciples of Jesus. We're dealing with another disciple, very significant. It's just not one of the 11 disciples. The second thing is that this name is very similar to another name that we get in one of the other gospel accounts. And this is from John, in John 19:25, talking about the scene at the cross. It says that near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now, the word Clopas here is C-L-O-P-A-S. The Clopas in our story is C-L-E-O-P-A-S. We have an added E here, but many scholars believe that this is the same guy. It's that Luke is writing to one audience, John is writing to another audience, and because it's a different set of audiences here, that maybe Clopas is appropriate in one context and Cleopas is appropriate in another context. To kind of give you an analogy or a connection is be like the name Thomas. That's acceptable in one area, but in another area it would be Tomas. It's T-H-O-M-A-S Thomas and T-O-M-A-S Tomas, and it's appropriate based on their context. And the difference is just one letter, but even the pronunciation is different. And many scholars believe that's actually what's going on here, that it is Cleopas and Mary, or Clopas and Mary, are the two disciples. And what's so fun and helpful about that is that this is actually a married couple. And so what I want to do now is I want to actually invite a married couple to come and join me for the episode. And I'm actually in the home of Mark Nogler, my creative director. And so this is Mark here and his lovely wife, Tanya. And Mark can do anything. Like this table, Mark built by hand. I mean, this whole set, fantastic. And everything that Mark does it's why everything has been elevated at Walking the Text. And so this is Mark and this is Tanya, dear, dear friends. And they're going to represent for us this married couple that was on the way to Emmaus on this particular day of Resurrection Sunday, nearly 2,000 years ago. Now, some of you may be looking in at the story and you go, okay, is this really a married couple? Is this really, Clopas and Mary? It may not be. Other people, probably shared a similar name, and Clopas may have been a really common name. But most scholars do believe that if this is not, in fact, Clopas and Mary, it's Clopas and a spouse, his spouse. And so it is, in fact, a married couple. And what makes that so interesting is that when you read the story, you find out that when they are eating, Jesus will take bread, and when he gives it to the married couple, that's the point at which they recognize what's going on. And so it just causes you to go, okay, let's just ask this question. You have a couple who is eating something. Where else do we find in Scripture a couple that is eating? And you go, oh, this takes us back to the Genesis story. Exactly. And so when you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, God says to Adam in Genesis 2:15, Adam, I do not want you to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for if you eat of it, you will surely die. Which was God's way of saying that, Adam, if you eat from the tree, sin and death, because they are connected, will invade the story. And so God gives this instruction, now you're Adam for a moment, is God says to Adam, I do not want you to eat from the tree. And by implication, Adam will then share that with Eve, that this is off limits. But the devastating reality is that when we come to Genesis chapter 3, they actually eat of the fruit of the tree. Now, just quick note, the Bible never says it was an apple. I think it was probably a pomegranate, but it's hard to get pomegranates around Nashville this time of year. But they actually eat from the tree. But here's what's fascinating about the language that is used, is that in Genesis 3, after they have taken from the tree, Eve has eaten from the fruit, she gives it to Adam. It says this in verse 7, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked," meaning sin had now entered the story. But the language in particular is that when they had eaten, it says, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened." And you go, I've heard that language before. Exactly. We go back to Luke 24, and after Jesus gives them the bread, it says in verse 31, then their eyes were opened, and they recognized Jesus. It's the exact same language in this moment. It's a remez, this Hebrew word that means hint. It means something is explained in a story or given in a story that's to connect you to a prior story so that you begin to see the connections of what's going on. And it's in this moment where we recognize that with the first married couple in Scripture, they ate, and sin and death entered the created order, and they recognized sin. But then you've got this story where once the couple eats, they recognize salvation. It's in this moment that they see Jesus for who he is. And it's like the whole story has been reversed. Because it's in Eden where sin and death enter the created story. Sin, death, pain, brokenness, all of these things were never intended to be part of God's story. In the moment that happened, when the first couple ate from the tree, the whole rest of the biblical story is how is God going to restore what was lost in this first meal by the first married couple. And Luke goes, because of the resurrection, everything has changed. And it's when they eat now of bread that they see Jesus for who he is, and they recognize in this moment everything that was lost in Eden in the first meal has now been restored in the resurrection, and it's being recognized in the first meal of the married couple after the resurrection here in Luke 24. And I know that for some of you, you're going, okay, that is absolutely amazing. Yes, there's one more piece to this that is absolutely astounding. And it doesn't just tell us that when they received the bread, that they recognized Jesus at that moment. Listen to this. Verse 30, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. He took bread, he gave thanks, he broke, and he gave. Now, anyone listening to this story in Luke from beginning to end will go, that language sounds really familiar. It is. Let's go to the Last Supper, Luke 22:19. It says here that during the meal, it says, and he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to the disciples, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. It's the same four verbs from the Last Supper. That when Jesus gathered around a table with his disciples, he took bread, he gave thanks or blessed God, because in Scripture you don't bless the food, it is already blessed because it comes from the hand of God. He gave thanks, blessing God, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, and he said, this represents my body. Every time you take it, do this in remembrance of me, because Jesus is saying it is going to be through my body and through my blood that redemption and restoration is going to take place. And he goes to the cross that next day. It's the Last Supper before his death that he took, blessed, broke, and gave. And now that he has been resurrected, you have another married couple, and it's the first supper on Resurrection Sunday, where Jesus again took bread, gave thanks, blessed, broke, and then gave it to this couple. And it was in this moment that they recognized Jesus for who he was. And it's the beauty of just how the scripture story plays on story, layer upon layer. And I love that after Jesus opened up the scriptures to them and then had a meal where all of these things were being connected, that it says that after they recognized Jesus, he then disappeared from their sight. That'd be an amazing moment just to watch what's going on. It's like, that is a first century mic drop right there. Verse 32, it says, they asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? That it's in a moment like this where we see all of these connections come together, that our hearts burn within us because the scriptures have been opened to us. This is what Luke is doing. This is what he's helping us to see. But the burning of our hearts isn't just because all of these connections are fantastic and amazing and unlocks ways for us to see the Bible that we've never seen before. It's that they all speak to the greater reality that the resurrection changed everything. Our hope, our life, everything that we have is because of what Jesus did on the cross and in the empty tomb. And so in this season, may our hearts burn anew again, not only because we've got great connections and great understanding, but Luke told this story for a reason, to instill hope to those who needed to know that everything that was lost, all the pain, all the brokenness, everything that's in the world, will one day be fully understood here on earth as it is in heaven, because of what Jesus Christ did on the cross and the empty tomb. That is worth celebrating, not just one day a year, but every single day of the year. So, you two, thanks so much for joining me for us, for this opportunity today. And thank you for just continuing to watch and to listen to what we're putting out at Walking the Text. And as always, as we end every episode, may you walk out the text well in your life.